Who here is ready for their CCPA implementation? Just show of hands. I heard one person today. Yes, you. You said that, like, we got this. And that is the only time I have, since CCPA sort of entered our frame of speaking, where I actually heard somebody say that they were ready for this. I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey at Tribune Publishing. So my role at Tribune is to worry about all of the stuff that folks don't generally want to worry about inside of a media company. So I get all the fun things that are hard and detailed. I joined the company at the end of 2017 as a result of an acquisition. And I came into the company and I was sitting down with our general counsel and we were talking about GDPR. And she was very anxious about GDPR, and I was very anxious about GDPR. And so we started talking about, like, what are we going to do? It's like, it's here. We have to do something. And then we decided we weren't going to do anything about GDPR because we didn't really have users or revenue there. So we turned off Europe. That was our solution for GDPR. As I have colleagues both within the company and peers who are taking European holidays, they will text me and say, hey, by the way, can't get to the Chicago Tribune from France. I'm like, you're welcome. Probably will never be able to get to Chicago Tribune from France. So we were worrying a lot about that. And then we decided not to worry. We went into this year and we started worrying a lot about browsers because browsers were really started screwing up our game across all sorts of things, right? So you've got this situation with expiring cookies. You've got this situation with incognito mode. And this, I think, is going to be important to set the stage as we start talking about CCPA itself. Man, we have just been fighting a rearguard action against browsers for the entire year. So our CMO, super smart guy, Mark Campbell, he's in charge of our digital subs program, and he is completely up in arms that Google has introduced a new version of Chrome that allows users to subvert his ability to have a pay meter, right? And as we think about what do we have to do in order to maintain persistence of consent as it comes to CCPA, this browser thing is a huge issue for us. So apparently California is in America, even though it's confusingly called the Republic of California. What the hell? But it is in the United States. And even though we decided to sell the LA Times and San Diego Union Tribune, unrelated to CCPA, by the way, that was just a happy coincidence, it still turns out that we have a lot of audience there and we still make a lot of money there, which means that unless they secede, and we don't know, it's crazy political times, they might, that this is something that we're going to have to pay attention to. So when we started taking a look at it, it's tricky, right? The scope is broader, actually, than what GDPR was. This legislation, unfortunately, is becoming the framework for legislation across the country. So, other states, in lack of a federal privacy standard, are looking to California as sort of the playbook for what privacy should potentially be in their state. And given how hastily this legislation came together, that's really, really concerning because it means like we're truly going to have a dog's breakfast of compliance that we have to deal with. And the penalties are big, right? Like the private right of action, $7,500 per infraction. If you think about what it means to get this wrong, it could be unbelievably expensive. One of the people in the finance team actually did some math on this and then decided that we needed a cross-company effort in order to get ready, and we're getting there. Wait, green button, Whitmore. So there's some big issues, right? And I think that these are big issues for all of us, but specifically for Tribune. This impacts every place that we have a customer relationship. And given that we are a traditional media company, this also means with our print subscribers. So it's huge. And I will say that it adds some complexity for us that if you are a digital-only business, you may not have to think about. But just to put a pin in this for a second, our digital systems, it turns out, we're way more ready for CCPA than our legacy systems. Vendor compliance is critical, and I think that one of the things that CCPA got a little bit right was the fact that they couldn't, unlike GDPR, just shift the responsibility. Vendors couldn't just shift the responsibility back to the publisher, but it's still a lot to comply. We are in contract review right now. We've got hundreds and hundreds of contracts that are potentially impacted as a result of this legislation that require some level of rework. We've got 2 months to do that. That's a lot. As I mentioned, the financial penalties are huge, and then there's just this stuff that happens every day, like, oh no, this on its own is fine, and this on its own is fine, but when we put it together, it ain't fine. So the juggling of this is super, super hard. So we've got publishers, advertisers, ad tech platforms all running in different directions as it relates to an attempt to comply. Managing this, we actually feel, is going to be table stakes as consumers outside of California become aware of privacy as a currency. They're going to demand that the companies that they work with comply. Currently, and I mentioned this, the legislative, advertising, and platform ecosystems are not in sync, and we expect as legislation rolls out across different states that will become more so. The compliance is complex. The UX is super difficult to get right. And this morning, before coming into Ignite, I was on the phone with our chief privacy officer and some of our product people, really figuring out, like, how do you get this right in terms of a presentation? It's also not cheap, and the impacts to revenue are potentially big. So, a lot of people say, like, what is the team that works on this? And I will say I'm lucky to be plugged into a lot of folks that look like me, not actually like me. That would be creepy if they all had beards and pocket squares, but people who occupy a similar role within their organization. It's like, how are you doing this? Like, do you set up a privacy office? Do you rely on tech for this? Really, we have taken a super integrated approach. So if you count around the wheel here, there's like 15 different individuals within Tribune Publishing who are responsible for this, as well as an executive steering committee and 10 plus partner vendors that we are working with specifically to make sure that we are in the same place as Fluent and ready, for January 1st of 2020. But it's a lot of folks representing a lot of different disciplines here because, as I mentioned, the impacts happen all over throughout the company, and there are these aha moments that we are continually seeing, like, this thing from consumer marketing is fine, this thing from advertising is fine, but when we put it here in our data backbone, it is no longer fine, right? And so those are the things that we are continually having to watch out for. So here's just a little timeline, and like arrows that go up and to the right. My budget meeting's on Monday, so I was just thinking in this way. So we really started in Q4 of 2018 in terms of putting together the nucleus of the working group that is still there, right? And these are folks from compliance and audit and legal and product and advertising. That really still constitutes like the whole. We ran through a directed audit with an outside company. We started identifying the vendor partners that were going to be critical for us to get through this, that list of 10 that I was talking about. We actually have begun bringing in new hires. So I mentioned we hired a chief of privacy. This question gets asked, where did you put them? Tribune's a big company. We could have put them in audit and compliance. We could have put them in legal. We put them with me. So we actually put them in operations because we felt that their impact would be the greatest if they were working with operating groups in order to implement the changes in policy and procedure. We are in the process of changing our process development, That's going on right now. Systems integration has begun, and we will be ready on January 1st. Now, inside of this, there's all sorts of like risk mitigation. There are edge cases that we may not be 100% ready for, but over the last year and a half, we have gotten ready enough that we feel like we've kind of drained the liability out of this. We do think that there are bright spots here. And so, I've been talking about like complexity and cost and everyone running around like a chicken with their head cut off. All of that's true, but this is a good thing for the ecosystem. And I forget who said it, but one of the panelists just mentioned like, this is a time to get our act cleaned up. And I think having worked in this space literally since the mid-90s, the concerns about privacy in digital have been real. And I sell this advertising, and I worry about it. So I think that this is actually good, and I think that that we will have better relationships with our readers and our clients as well. I think that for those of us who make this investment, really the juice is worth the squeeze, or the juice is, you squeeze and then you get juice. That's right. The juice is worth the squeeze. And I think that there will be differentiation that is made. Like we all know when we go to a skeezy website right now, like we get sucked in by clickbait and we're like, oh, no, right? They will not be able to participate in this. So I think that there is some like long tail publishers that are gonna get beat up as a result of this. That's probably okay. And I think that those are able to comply, are going to have these stronger relationships. And then in the medium to long term, like, I have told our executive committee, like, to expect some turbulence in advertising as a market shifts from being able to follow that user around everywhere to really having to rely on audience data in a different manner. So in the short term, there may be some disruption there if people are truly electing to not sell their data. But I think over the medium and long term, it puts us in a healthier position. So I'm going to go join Tiffany now, and we'll continue with the panel. This is supposed to be a fireside chat, and
Yes.
I noticed that there was no fire. So
I was going to complain about that too. I was promised a fire.
we have one.
Oh, nice.
We have one somewhere. It doesn't recognize my fingerprint. How appropriate for
For a privacy panel.
Okay, no fire, guys. Sorry.
All right. So you started out, you made a kind of a military metaphor, so I'm going to draw on that.
I like this.
When CCPA first came about, we had kind of weathered the GDPR storm, and I started referring to it internally as the, Pearl Harbor of privacy. And the reason being that you were not alone in partners and clients that we work with that just kind of evaluated the requirements of GDPR versus the revenue impact and just said, hey, like, not going to go there kind of over Europe in the short term. So you missed the pre-party, so to speak, on GDPR. How has that kind of influenced your preparation around CCPA and kind of maybe different in how you approach it versus others who've been through that storm?
Well, I will say that when we were looking for our VP of Privacy, we absolutely demanded that we get somebody who had gone through the battle of GDPR, right? So, and I was flip in my description of slides because sometimes that just makes for a funny story, which I appreciate. We actually, there was a working group around GDPR, and that working group stayed fairly intact, and CCPA kind of followed on the heels of it quickly enough that by the time we were deciding not to become GDPR compliant and turn it off, there were already rumblings that CCPA was happening. So.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we have a similar situation internally where, we had a GDPR cross-functional team that's kind of evolved into this California team. I think what's so interesting about California, though, is it is here. Most of us can evaluate, traffic or whatever your metrics are. You're not going to ignore California for a variety of reasons. Of course, part of what is so interesting about CCPA is that we are simultaneously dealing with all of these changes in the browser world. by all these companies that are based in California, which is the irony.
It is irony, and again, we feel like the impulse is correct, right? The impulse towards giving users more control over their data, their digital identity, like all of these are good. All of these are good things. I will say that we probably fell down a little bit as an industry in not getting ahead of this. So, I was on the IB board years ago. We were talking about it. We didn't do anything. Discontent bubbled up to a degree that it became a legislative action rather than a self-regulatory action. That was our fault. Like, as an industry, we did not come to grips with that. Now we're dealing with the fallout of having sort of like platforms running in another direction, like on the fly ad tech solves going in another directions, and legislators that, God bless them, but don't understand this space at all, trying to come up with something that they feel is going to be amenable for their constituents. We are chasing, and if anyone has a great solution, find me at cocktail hour, and let's talk about persistence of consent. So we're pretty excited about Cartographer, right? We think that the Cartographer product that is getting rolled out is one that helps us sort of manage the persistence of consent. But if I opt out of, if I say do not sell on Chicago Tribune on my phone, but then I'm home later that night and I'm on my laptop or tablet or something like that, like how are we making this connection? If Safari is expiring that cookie every 24 hours, how do I not ask you every time you come in the door whether I can sell your data? A, that's at odds with the legislation itself, right? You're only supposed to ask that question every 12 months. And B, is really annoying from the standpoint of your user experience. So these are the things that we're trying to figure out. And unfortunately, it's like sled dogs all going in an opposite direction. And we're the people holding the reins.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're right in the sense that there's this effort to kind of constrict around privacy, right? It's easy to kind of pull the walls in and say, well, due to regulations, we've got to create closed roads or closed exits to protect privacy of users and kind of protect ourselves from liability. I think where we could have helped as an industry, as you said, is earlier education of regulators, because now they're playing catch up. They truly, I mean, I'm making broad sweeping generalizations here, but they truly don't understand. I happen to live in DC, for better or for worse. I know too many lawyers and too many people that work on the Hill. And someone was saying to me the other day, we're really struggling here. Like, why are all of these tech companies encrypting everything? We can't get access to things that we need as a government. And I'm like, well, you should talk to regulators in California, because this is in many ways, a response to some of the privacy restrictions, right? There's huge risk around data breach and so forth, and so they're closing off those walls. And of course, now you guys want access, which we can all agree or disagree on whether that's okay. That's a different conference. But it's interesting because they're all kind of converging in this one space.
It's fascinating, and so I had the opportunity to have dinner with the sponsor of the bill that became CCPA, and there was this very earnest belief that we were simply going to be, as a result of this legislation, that we could simply roll back the clock to like 2007, right? Before, what was the first BT targeting?
Before Tupac disappeared?
Before Tupac disappeared, yeah. And it was like, pre-audience science, right? Or revenue science, or whatever it was called then, right? So there's no behavioral targeting. It's just like the web with display ads and everything was magical. And it was like, wow, okay, that is impossible. Like, the genie is fully out of the bottle. So there's no way that we actually roll back to these halcyon days of like untargeted display ads where everything is contextual. But that was what they earnestly believed. And it was it was a crazy conversation, one that was sort of like, fraught with gasps when you spell out, like, here are the economic implications of this. Here are the types of publishers that are maybe not going to be able to survive. Here's what it means for a couple of big platforms that have a tremendous volume of first-party data that they continue to maintain access to. And I think, your point on education of the folks who who are either sponsoring these bills or writing this legislation is huge, because we neglect them at their peril. And I know sometimes you see photos of Congress and you're like, yeah, they're never going to get it, but they do have staffers that will. And I think that work there is much needed.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite parts, or I should say least favorite parts about CCPA, but I think it's a good illustration of kind of the lack of understanding, is if you actually read the definition of personal data in CCPA as it's currently drafted today. Household information is personal data, right? So imagine you live in a house with a bunch of roommates post-college. In theory, that household information collectively is personal data, which is obviously antithetical to the privacy preferences of all of those kind of individual roommates. So I think that's on the table for revision and 2.0, as they're calling it. But again, just a great highlight of the lack of understanding.
Yeah, we read the AG guidelines that just came out. I guess that was last week, and it's like, okay, there's still work there. We look at the IB framework that was just proposed a couple of days ago. It's like, okay, so you can start to see a pathway through, and you can figure out how to mitigate your risk on this stuff. But it is hard, and then it's going to be really difficult to say, like, what happens when Illinois does this differently?
Right.
And I would say, for those of you who are thinking about CCPA, and you're all smart people because you're at Ignite, and Andy only invites the smartest of friends and family to Ignite. Obviously your whatever framework you set up needs to accommodate the fact that there's probably, what are there, like 14 or so other states right now that have stuff working through. So by 2021, you probably are going to have at least a majority of those that have passed that you're also having to comply with, that will all shade differently than what CCPA itself does.
By the way, you mentioned the AG guidance. You also talked about your budget. For those of you who are going into budget season, don't let your finance team read the AG guidelines. I think they say in the AG guidelines that like the expected cost of CCPA compliance for an average company is like 20 grand. So
if you guys buy me drinks, I'll tell you how much it really costs.
it's not 20 grand, for sure.
Yeah, definitely not. And this again, I think is sort of like the innocence of the authors, right? They felt like this was going to be an easy thing for them to clean up. But I look at sort of the publisher that was New York Daily News pre-acquisition by Tribune, and what which Daily News would have been impacted. It had a big California audience, et cetera. It would have been a material portion of digital expense budget for us to comply, right? And so, thank God, that's now tucked under, it's tucked under a broader organization where those expenses can be defrayed across multiple properties. But it's a tough time to be, a small or medium small go-it-alone publisher when you're looking at something like CCPA.
Absolutely. So we have our takeaways up here. I'm guessing that's my cue to wrap it up here. So, wow, Grant, you had a lot of takeaways. Are you chasing down my job here?
It's as evident by the presentation. I like all the words.
All right, well, I will do my short one, and then I'll let Grant finish this up. So, I mean, I think on CCPA, it's it's ill-informed to prepare for one law, like Grant said. We had GDPR, that was a precursor, but there's a lot of stuff in flight, and I think privacy is never going to contract. Likewise, this industry is not going away, right? Despite the claims of the sky is falling, it's not going away. And so what I would encourage is just, you have to do something, and you have to try to kind of comply with the spirit of these laws in whatever way you can. If you're waiting for the perfect guidance, whether it comes from California, Europe, it's never going to happen. So don't let perfect stand in don't let perfect stand in the way of the good. Just start working, get your team together, and just start chipping away at it.
I completely agree with the don't let perfect stand in the way of good. And I will go right into, this is going to take some time, and it's going to cost some money. And I think the first thing that you need to do is understand where you are most vulnerable, right? So you're not going to get this 100% right out of the gate. We are not going to be 100% good out of the gate. We will be 98% good. And that last 2%, you know, we're force ranking where we think we've got the greatest risk. And we are doing that with partners. So it would be terrifying to have to do this on our own. And so there are companies out there that can really help you with this. If you want to talk about who we're using, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. Just, you know, grab me at drinks later or whatever, and I can point you in the right direction, or at least what we feel to be the right direction. And at the end of this, there is opportunity here, right? Like, it's not just a cost. There are going to be some rapids before you enter the beautiful lake, but at the end of the road, this is probably something that is good for us as an ecosystem, and done right, good for you as a publisher or advertiser.
Great. Well, thank you very much.